Welcome everybody to one more session at the Nabanna Earth Weekend New Festival 2021. As you all know, this year we are doing it as a virtual festival because we are unable to gather in Santiniketan, which is what we would ideally have loved to have done, especially I think for this session, which is a session that in some ways all about Santiniketan and about the memories and memoirs of two very, very important writers who both write about what they experienced when they were young and they were in the Santiniketan, which was established by Rabindranath Tagore. The session is called Our Santiniketan, in Bangla, Amader Santiniketan, and it's the popular Hindi novelist Shivani and the equally popular Bengali writer Mahasweta Devi with their memoirs of Tagore's Santiniketan, brought alive through readings from the translations of both the writers' works. In the case of Shivani, Mrinal and Ira Pande, both writers and translators in their own right, are going to talk about the book, going to read from the book, both the translated version which Ira has done, as well as the original Hindi, which always has its own charm because you can hear the language and hear the sound of that language. And Radha Chakravarty, who has translated Mahasweta Devi's memoir, Amader Santiniketan, which is coming out later in the year, will also talk about the book and read from her translation. So before we plunge into this session, let me quickly tell you a little more about the writers and the panelists who are here with us today. Renal Pandey taught at the Universities of Allahabad, Delhi and Bhopal before switching to journalism in the mid-1980s. She has edited well-known Hindi periodicals Vama and Saptahik Hindustan for the Times of India and the Hindustan Times Group, respectively. She has worked in the visual media as editor and anchor for Hindi news at NDTV and India's public broadcaster Doordarshan. In 2000, she became India's first woman chief editor of a multi-edition Hindi daily, Hindustan, part of the Hindustan Times Group. She was also the first woman to be Secretary General of the Editors Guild of India. She is the founder president of the Indian Women's Press Corps, a national body of India's women journalists. She was a member of the group that prepared Shramshakti, India's first documentation of the status and lives of women workers in the unorganized informal sector. The report was published in 1989. After retiring in 2009, she was appointed chairman of India's national broadcaster Prasar Bharati in 2010. Renal Pandey writes in both Hindi and in English. Her work covers fiction, plays, essays on contemporary Indian women, and India's rural women and their sexual and reproductive lives. She was awarded the Padma Shri in 2006 for her services in the field of journalism. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mrinal. I've been trying to make you part of this festival for several years, and I'm so glad it worked out, even though this year it's only virtual. Thank you. Ira Pandey, who also happens to be a daughter of Shivani and Mrinal's sister, is in her own right an established writer and translator with a lot of work to her credit. She has translated several books from Hindi into English. She's been awarded the Crossword and Sahitya Academy Translation Prize for her translation of Manohar Shyam Joshi's, is it Datta Professor? Datta Professor. Yeah, in 2009 and 2010 respectively. Thank you so much for joining us, Ira. I'm so glad that you're here with us today and that nothing prevented this get-together from happening. We come now to Radha Chakravarty, the third person on the panel, who is a writer, a critic, and a translator. She has co-edited The Essential to Go, which was published by Harvard and Vishwa Bharati, which was nominated Book of the Year 2011 by Martha Nussbaum. Her works on Tagore include Novelist Tagore, translations of Gora, Jokhir Bali, Boyhood Days, Farewell Song, which is Sheshet Kobita, Four Chapters, which is forthcoming, and The Land of Cards, and the edited volumes, Shades of Difference and the Tagore Phenomenon, which is also forthcoming. She is the author of Feminism and Contemporary Women Writers. She was nominated for the Crossword Translation Award 2004 for In the Name of the Mother by Mahasweta Devi. She has also edited several anthologies of South Asian writing. Her poems have appeared in various collections. Forthcoming books include her translations of Mahasweta Devi's memoirs and selected essays of Qazi Nazrul Islam. She is Professor of Comparative Literature and Translation Studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us, Radha. So glad to have you with us on the panel today. Moderating the session is Ananya Dutta Gupta, who teaches at the Department of English and other modern European languages at Vishwa Bharati Santiniketan. Her revised Orient Black Swan annotated edition of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, Book 1, 2012, is currently in worldwide circulation. She has published book reviews, translations of essays, poetry, short stories. Her travel writing, creative nonfiction, and poetry may be found online at News India, Rupkatha Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies, Cafe Dissensus, Caesure, and several others. Her most recent works are a bilingual book of anecdotes, Abhibuli, The Diary of a Quipster Boy, an ethnographic essay on reading Camus in the time of Corona. Thank you for joining us from Shantiniketan, Onunna. So glad that you're here with us today. And now I'd like to invite Onunna to take over and lead this panel forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anjum. Such a privilege to be here and to be welcoming our distinguished panelists. If this were to 2020 or 2019, I'm sure Anjum and I would have wanted to have this conversation out in the open somewhere in Shantiniketan, maybe under some of the trees that the two authors we are here to discuss often mention in their memoirs. But I guess it's still in the fitness of things that we are meeting in virtual Shantiniketan of sorts, because I think Shantiniketan, and that's what the books actually tell us, has managed to travel. It's constantly traveling. It's traveled both in space and time. So it's lovely to be talking about Shantiniketan in Vishwabharati's centenary year, and to be talking to a global audience, many of the members of whom might have long standing or, well, brief association with Shantiniketan. So to get the kind of conversation, and I'm very excited because it's been such a treat reading the two books over the past week or so. But I guess we'll reverse the order somewhere. We'll begin with Radha Chakravarty's lovely translation of Mahasweta Devi's Amader Shantiniketan. And Radha needs no introduction. And interestingly, Radha has been here at the department where I teach. She was here a few years back to talk about translation at an academic conference. And she is bringing to us later this year a memoir by, I'm proud to say, an alumna of the department. Mahasweta Devi actually went to the Department of English and did her BA here. So interesting coincidences there, or maybe they are not coincidences. So may I now invite Radha to tell us a few things about the book itself, why she thought of translating it, and then should she think fit, maybe do us do a reading for us, and then we might take the discussion forward from there. Thanks, Radha.
Thank you, Anuna. It's a great honor to be part of this festival and to be talking here in such company to such an audience about my forthcoming book on Mahasweta Devi. Why I thought of translating this book is because it brings to light less familiar Mahasweta Devi, where we see her in a nostalgic mode We see her speaking in a different voice. We don't hear the angry activist whose white-hot rage impels her to write. And yet all the values that form the core of her activism are there in this book, but articulated in such a personal, intimate manner and in such a delightful conversational way that I just felt that it was important to introduce the non-Bengali reading world to this other Mahasweta, the less known Mahasweta, and to get a deeper understanding of where she came from really, where many of her values and attitudes were shaped and formed. And that place was no other than Santiniketan. So it was really, very special for me to translate her book, Amader Santiniketan, into English, a brief memoir, but an important one. And in this initial presentation, I'll just speak, I'll just offer an overview of the book, maybe do a little reading, and also read out little snippets from the book as I'm speaking. And I'll begin with something she says about memory. Like a dazzling feather that has fluttered down from some unknown place. In my mind, it remains enclosed within a box made of glass. I can turn it this way or that, look at it from any angle, whenever I desire. How long will the feather keep its colors, waiting? The feather stands for memories of childhood. Memories don't wait. So Amader Santiniketan, translated here as Our Santiniketan, was first published in Bengali in 2001. In this brief memoir, Mahasweta reminisces about her early school days from 1936 to 1938, the years she spent at Santiniketan in the living presence of Rabindranath Tagore. The title echoes the opening words of the Santiniketan anthem, asserting a passionate sense of belonging to the place. Amader Santiniketan, Amader Shob Hote Apon, our very own Santiniketan, dearest to our hearts. Mahasweta's reminiscences conjure up a glowing image of a bygone Santiniketan as a unique place that left a permanent imprint on those who came to know it closely. Seen through the innocent eyes of a young girl, a forgotten Santiniketan comes to life. The place, its people, flora and fauna, educational environment, work culture, intellectual and creative freedom, cultural diversity, harmonious coexistence between natural and human worlds, and above all, the towering presence of Tagore himself. We get a glimpse also of the private Mahasweta, her inner life, family and associates, and the early experiences that shaped her personality. Our Santiniketan testifies to the lasting influence of Tagore on Mahasweta Devi, although her own image as a firebrand writer-activist appears so different from Tagore's own. Lively vignettes present Tagore's innovative ideas on education as they were actually implemented in practice. During classes under trees, students observed squirrels and ants and learned lessons in work culture. They learned to recognize different trees, flowers, seasons, and living creatures. And Mahasweta says, they would plant in our minds the seeds of great philosophical ideals like trees. The methods were clearly unorthodox. And I quote again what she says, a work schedule indeed, identifying trees, raiding fruit trees, and in the rains, running towards the kopai, all of us getting soaked together, learning how to swim as we plunged about in those red, muddy waters. At Santiniketan, Mahasweta developed her awareness of nature, environment, and ecology, which connected Tagore's vision of the coexistence between human, natural, and animal worlds to her own later environmental activism. And here I'll read a very short passage from the book. Sometime between 36 and 38, China Bhavan was built. Those were the times when the construction was underway. They stored water in a tank to be used for building work. One day, Tejesh Da took us there, and this is Tejesh Chandra Sen, who taught them nature studies. Look at the tadpoles. There, those creatures with tails swimming about, they're tadpoles. When they become frogs, their tails will fall off. Are frogs of any use? Asked Jolly, her face a picture of innocence. In the world of nature, every creature has a role. Frogs live on mosquito eggs and larvae. They provide therapeutic treatment for malaria. Do you understand? And then snakes will swallow the frogs, and the frogs will try to escape. Snakes are so scary. Why? Why do you say that? Frogs are food for snakes. That's why they consume them. In the world of animals, no creature kills another without a reason, but humans will kill anybody. Now, with every passing day, I see how humans destroy everything. Through the agency of humans, so many species of trees, vines, shrubs, and grasses have vanished from the face of the earth. So many species of forest life, aquatic creatures and fish. So many species of birds have become extinct, lost forever. Their numbers are countless, and they will never be seen again. Rabindranath was born in 1861. In his 39th year, we entered the 20th century. At the end of the same century, I write this book. In these 139 years, a great calamity has befallen the natural world at every level. In the world, in India, in every region of India. Today, using science and technology, it may be possible to build an edifice 300 stories high, but the balance of nature cannot be restored. Santiniketan had taught us to love the spirit of life, for the spirit of life has spread its welcome everywhere.
Lovely. That was, I mean, I didn't grow up here, but I could so much relate to the empathy that you were talking, or that you kind of brought, that you foregrounded in terms of what Santiniketan teaches you, kind of being able to connect with nature at a very organic level. Even if you haven't been brought up here, if you begin everything rather late as an adult. What I was particularly struck by was the way she conceptualizes memory, because you see, she's constantly insisting on the fact that she never would come back to Santiniketan. She's writing this really late. So she's really digging into her memory, almost like a kind of a Thakumar Chuli of sorts, an inexhaustible wallet. So this kind of, this leads me to the question about whether Santiniketan is something like a bubble. I mean, it might be a controversial question, but we probably need to ask this. It's always something that both Mahasweta Devi and Shivani associate with childhood, with young adulthood in a very utopian, idyllic way. It's a historic, it's something that could have only have been possible within a particular time frame, with everything falling into place, and then it was gone after a while. There's that sense of loss and nostalgia. So did you also sense that somewhere?
Very much. Thank you for asking this question about memory, which is what I started with, because I think one of the fascinating things about this book is not just what it tells us, but the way it unfolds as a kind of struggle with a failing memory, because Mahasweta Devi by then was beginning to develop amnesia, and she was struggling with that. And these lapses in memory, and trying to search in her mind for something that's lost, not just because it's in the past, but because her memory is failing her. And that drama gets enacted in this text. So in fact, at one point in the text, she wonders, and I'm quoting, sorry?
There's a non-linearity to it. She's going back and forth.
Yes.
Playing around with time in a very infectious way. That kind
very
of
interesting way.
Very magic the narrative. Yeah.
Yes, yes, it's not a linear narrative, and she goes back and forth in time. There are digressions, and she keeps kind of, comparing and contrasting with the present, which is also something I'd like to say more about in a bit. But what she says about memory here, where she kind of, instead of, what happens when people write their autobiography typically is that autobiography is a form that has certain truth claims that I'm telling the truth about my life. But here she is very open and artless about saying that I can't remember. Was it this or was it that? She says, diving into the ocean of memory and retrieving one water-soaked photograph after another. Am I recounting all the details accurately? So it's very fascinating and also rather disconcerting, because the text seems to offer a mix of fact and a kind of myth making. She's kind of creating a myth. You talked about bubble, and I felt that there's a kind of myth making going on in this text, creating a myth about a bygone lost Santiniketan. And there's a mix of sharp recall, something she remembers very vividly, and then there's a lot of bewildered forgetting. So there is this kind of, double quality about the text. It's got a patchwork effect to it, which I think is fascinating. And it's not carefully crafted as a work of fiction would be. You hear the voice of Mahasweta kind of, grappling with herself, as it were, even as she's addressing an imaginary reader who's obviously much younger than herself, and says, oh, you wouldn't know what pens in our time was like, where you dipped a pen with a handle into, handmade ink and wrote with that, and you wouldn't know that kind of a tone which she adopts towards the imagined reader.
It's an intergenerational conversation.
Yes, it's definitely, it's intended to be one like that. And so the narrative kind of, it draws us in with what it's telling us, but it also baffles us with what it withholds or reinvents or simply, passes over saying, I can't remember. In the middle of a sentence, she'll break off and say, oh, I can't remember. And she'll, move on with the text. So the text teases us also with its silences, its uncertainties, and its incompleteness. But that itself is the fascination of it. It's got a quality of very elusive kind of magic to it, almost like the image of the feather which is fading. It's going to lose its colors, and you have to capture those colors before they fade. So it's got that kind of an effect. So yes, memory, and the game's memory plays, and in the process connecting past with present. And what happens, therefore, is on the one hand, nostalgia, a kind of idealization of Santiniketan as kind of idyll, but also a sharp critique of the present. And, that goes on alongside. So, for instance, and I'm just trying to you see what happens is you hear a double voice. You hear the innocence of the child, but you also hear the mature voice of the author, kind of commenting on things. The analysis is kind of coming from yes.
She's a little ambivalent about Santiniketan or Vishwabharati, the learning space becoming something like a central university. So somewhere it seems to have been formalized or institutionalized, and that added rigor may have taken away from her vision of or understanding of what Santiniketan stands for. So there's a loss there too somewhere.
There is a sense of loss. In fact, she says, anyway, Santiniketan has grown up. I mean, I'm again quoting from the text. Santiniketan has grown up. That is inevitable with the passage of time. Vishwabharati has become a central university, one of few such universities in India. I feel that Vishwabharati could have developed into a university with a different character. She says that wistfully. And she says it could be a place where translation and dissemination of literature, the literatures of all the Indian languages into other languages of the world, and translation of world literatures into Indian languages would be practiced, where students, scholars, researchers from India and abroad would come and reside. Research would flourish, so would publication. And she says, in such a place, in the truest sense, the world would reside in one nest. I dream of such a university created with Rabindranath's name as its central inspiration. The significance of the name Vishwabharati would also expand, crossing all frontiers. So as I said, there is a kind of critique of the present. There's also a kind of a vision. There's a visionary quality to what she's saying, you know, about what might have been. And it's again, as I said, something that's inspired by the past, but always it brings her into reflections on the present, which are equally important in the book.
Yes. We'll come back to you, Radha, but let us now also talk about that lovely other book, Shivani's, again titled Amade Santiniketan. And I'd like to begin by asking you, or we might actually come to this question later, the shared title and the fact that both the books or authors draw upon the anthem or Ashram Shongit that you mentioned. And I was also remembering Rani Chondo, who's mentioned by both of them, naming her memoir Shob Hote Apun, which is also from that same anthem, celebrating the whole spirit of education in, open spaces, everything that Santiniketan stands for to both the authors in question. And the fact that if both these writers have a thesis, it is what you mentioned as you were rounding off your presentation, the idea of a particular kind of pedagogy, a particular kind of vision of education with special emphasis on children, and Tagore's extraordinary understanding of how what children respond to and how he develops that into an educational philosophy and practice. So Mrinal and Ira, lovely again to be able to talk to you about this lovely book, and in such a really infectious translation. It's so I must congratulate you on it. It's a lovely read. So would you like to talk about the two principles we've been we broached to you?
Well, as I have mentioned, this has been one of my most favorite of my mother's books. I mean, my mother had an enormous estate which she left behind, and it's not going to be possible for any of us to be able to bring it all into another language. Some of these are untranslatable. But this particular book had been at the back of my mind for a very, very long time. And I've been working on it in bits and pieces over about 5 years or so. And Renal and I have been in very close conversation about the book, because she's my go-to person for, any editorial or, any interventions and suggestions that she gives are always very welcome. So when I finished the first part of the book, I found that it was such a slim little book that it was almost like the froth on top of a glass of milk. You hadn't really got to the, to the real stuff. And so she suggested that why don't we also mine from the beautiful tributes that she's written to many, many people there. I wasn't able to include all of them because then, the balance of the book would go. But I picked out for the second part a whole series of very lovingly written tributes, which are all connected with Santiniketan, with either people whom she knew there or whom she was in close connection with through her life. For instance, Hajari Prasad Dwivedi's wife, whom she calls Bhabiji, was not a teacher, but she was like a Guru Mata. And this book actually worked for me because it was a homage to the gurus who created her and a whole generation of those students who passed through their hands into what they became. I mean, it's not any wonder that each one of them was unique in different ways. I mean, some of them, of course, were world figures and have remained part of the whole lore of Santiniketan. But there are also characters there like an odd cook, or that Sarju Maharaj who loves music and who came from Chhapra in Bihar, and every time he heard of a rehearsal, he'd tie his gamcha on his head and head off to sing lustily with it. you know, that kind of, or Dr. Babu, the character who she mentioned. So there are a whole lot of people who were not teachers in the way that, let's say, Kshiti Mohan Babu was, or Hajai Prasad Dwivedi ji was, or Gosai ji, or, but they are so vividly portrayed. I mean, my mother really had a talent for remembering. And I was listening to what Radha was talking about, Mahasweta ji writing at, you know, a sort of a late stage in her life, when a lot of those memories get completely mixed up and you can't separate them and you wonder whether you remembered correctly. This book was written almost more than 50 years ago, I think. You know, she wrote it in the early 60s at some point, if I'm not mistaken. And already she had, you know, she'd been out of there for 20 or 25 years. But she remembered every little thing. I mean, it's incredible how her memory, especially about places and people, this is something that when I was writing my memoir or her biography kind of thing, my first book on her, she died at the age of 80, just short, a few months short of 80. From the age of 3 onwards, she has chronicled her life so vividly. And she had, you know, a great talent for picking out what was, like a magpie, what was the shiniest part of that. So yes, there was a lot of romantic idealism in the way that she portrays her gurus. But it's a very touching and a very moving homage to the teachers. You know, there are so many of us now who regret the kind of relationship that we had is not available to our grandchildren, for instance, you know, children who are now, and especially in this age of Corona, where they're only listening to virtual lessons and whatever. Our teachers really made us into what we were. So this is why I think I decided that this was the right time for it to come out. We must remember that learning is what you learn from a teacher. You cannot learn by yourself. Your mind plays tricks on you unless you have somebody who guides you. You know, your knowledge doesn't really matter if it's only information. That was one. And the other was that it, you know, that kind of pastoral, idyllic innocence, which only children can preserve. Because I think, as you say, you know, dark things don't happen in childhood. You don't confront death, you don't confront failure, disappointment. That world is what sustains you. And I think that is one of the reasons why in these very dark and miserable times when there's nothing to hang on to, you have to remember that there is something worth living for. There is something that will, yes, I mean, I'm an incurable optimist, and that is why this is really written for my grandchildren and my nieces and nephews, many of whom now don't read Hindi very much. Just to make it available to them that this is what your grandmother or great-grandmother wrote. That is why. It's a kind of personal thing also, carrying on.
Would you like to read a little excerpt from the book?
Okay. I'll read just from the beginning of the book, because that's how it, you know, that sets the tone of the whole thing. She begins by saying, as I sit down to remember all those teachers who have inspired me, a kaleidoscope flashes past my eyes. Like a Buddhist prayer wheel that mesmerizes one with its ceaseless turns, the images suck me into a tunnel that takes me very far back. I tumble down that abyss and see several faces rescued from the mists of time. Some of them are serious and somber, others smile or laugh. At the end of this magical tunnel, it seems to me as if the entire faculty of Santiniketan, like a lineup of debt collectors, waits for me to pay back what I owe them. Let me start at the very beginning, from the day I first met Gurudev in 1935. My older sister Jayanti, our brother Tribhuvan, and I had come to Santiniketan all the way from Almora. As the youngest of the 3 siblings, I was admitted to Path Bhavan, the school section of the ashram. Soon after we settled in, the Path Bhavan principal, Dr. Dhiren Mohan Sen, took Jayanti and me to meet Gurudev. We reached Gurudev's house, Uttarayan, and we were told that he was sitting in another part of the house known as Shamali. The evening shadows were falling, and the blood-red earth turned dark as we neared Gurudev's chair. Dressed in a long black gown, the black cap he wore on his head highlighted his broad forehead and glowing face, and his eyes seemed lit up with an inner light. No wonder the Ashramites considered him the guru of gurus. And yet, this towering figure was also among the gentlest and kindest of men. His serene and compassionate gaze included everyone in a warm embrace, rich or poor, big or small. All of us, whether we'd come from India or Japan, China or Sri Lanka or wherever, stood before him every morning as children who had come to an enchanted garden. At the morning prayer assembly held every day in front of the ashram library, we met the Buddhist scholar Fan Chu, who had come all the way from China, as well as Khairuddin, a Muslim student from Sumatra, Sushila from Gujarat, and Kumudini from what then appeared to us a foreign land, Kerala. All of us stood with folded hands and closed eyes as we sang the hymns he had composed. Never once do I remember anyone trying to jostle someone or giggle or push. Such was the respect Gurudev invoked in all of us that whenever we were in his presence, we became better human beings. He looked up as we came near, and never, for as long as I live, will I forget that moment. Framed against the glow of the setting sun, he looked unlike any human being I'd ever seen. And to my child's eyes, he seemed to be what I imagined God would look like. Of their own volition, our hands came together, and Jayanti and I bowed at his feet. His hand passed lovingly over our heads, and he smiled as he asked gently, "Are you very homesick?" How did he know? I wondered. It goes on like this. That moment sort of defines the relationship, that from the moment these two sisters met Gurudev, he just reached out to them in a way. For two homesick girls who'd come all the way from Almora, didn't know a word of Bangla. Then, of course, it goes on to describe funny incidents also. But I thought that opening is really what defined the book and her relationship with Gurudev.
Yes, yes. I both books, and particularly Shivani's book is very rich in fun anecdotes, and I think what it's really important and what makes it really important for children or people who are either directly or indirectly associated with Santiniketan and would like to know more about what it was like to grow up there. The bit that's so interesting is that it's not an idyllic place in a kind of somber sort of way. It's a fun place. I think the fun is what really comes through in both the narratives. But I was also intrigued by very interesting split somewhere, and I think in part it's somewhat engineered. The latter half of the book is somber. It's, as you say, very dark. It reflects on death and disease and people sadly leaving the world. And again, you get a sense of Santiniketan somewhere becoming the mythopoeia that Radha was mentioning. It becomes a no place, a place that used to be but can no longer be kind of apprehended except in the mind and the heart. It doesn't exist anymore outside. That's what's so fascinating, and I think it's a rich historical document too, because it as part of this festival we are also remembering Satyajit Ray's association with Santiniketan, and there's a substantial section there in the latter half that talks about him. So would Mrinal like to say something about the book at this point, and maybe bring in Shivani's other works? Does Santiniketan figure anywhere in her novels? Fictional.
What you said about a bubble, it was, I think, in some ways, and they realized it also, because by the time my mother was writing this book, she was in her late 40s, and she'd had a very different life from the one that she was prepared for. I don't know about Bengal of her that period, which was probably a more liberal society. But my mother finished her undergraduation, came home, and straight away was married off in a very conservative Kumauni Brahmin family. And so she all of a sudden entered another world which bewildered her, because nothing in her upbringing, she had grown up in a mixed campus in the 1930s. She had had the most prominent artists as her gurus. She had learned languages, she had learned arts, she had learned music. She had been witness to music being created and made. All of a sudden, she comes to this very straight-laced, very severe-looking Hindu patriarchal society in Almora, and is married off to a man she had not met till then. And so it was, tranquility lived in emotions, not emotions recaptured in tranquility, but tranquility recaptured in emotions. So I think she has idealized certain portions. But as you rightly pointed out, towards the end of the book, death begins to enter. That little boy, she tells him, she's very fond of him, and when he's scared, then she tells him nothing will happen to him. After all, you are a man's child. And the boy dies an early death bitten by a snake. So there are those dark forebodings gathering on the horizon. But it's also full of mischievous laughter and humor. My mother retained a childlike sense of humor all through her life, even when she was in the ICU. And whenever we took turns to go and sit by her bedside for a very limited period, she would recount the joke of the day. What so and so dying on the bed next to her. She very macabre, black sense of humor there. But it is there in the book. I'll just read a very short bit in Hindi. I don't know how much of the. My mother says that she felt that she was very lucky that Gurudev actually held her hand and started teaching her the Bengali alphabet, how to write in Bengali. So she says, आज मुझे लिखते हुए गर्व बोध होता है कि मेरी बांग्ला वर्णमाला का अक्षरारंभ कराया था स्वयं गुरुदेव ने, और जब उन्हीं की दी गई सहज पाठ, Gurudev had written this primer for children learning Bengali called सहज पाठ. सहज पाठ के पाठ बौने था के बाग गाछे था के पाखी को सुनाने के महा उत्साह में गाछे था के बाग बौने था के पाखी सुना गए. तो गुरुदेव के पास बैठे प्रसिद्ध उपन्यासकार चारू बाबू की स्थूल देह सरल हंसी की तरंगों से दोलायमान हो उठी. पर मैं नहीं समझी. सहसा मंद स्मित से गुरुदेव का चेहरा उद्भासित हो उठा. कीरे तोरे देशे बुझे गाछे बाग थाके, क्या तेरे देश में पेड़ पर बाग रहते हैं? So it's full of little. Then she talks about the pride Gurudev took into how she naturally caught on the rhythm of Bangla and started reading, and not only reading, also singing. उत्तरायण में प्रत्येक वर्ष साहित्य सभा का आयोजन होता था. जब बांग्ला के मूर्धन्य साहित्यकार वहां आते, हमारे लिए उस साहित्य गोष्ठी का महत्व कुंभ मेले से कम नहीं होता. मेरे पास आज भी श्री जौलधर सेन, चारू बाबू, नरेंद्र मिश्र, सज्जनोकांत दास आदि की लिखित ऐसी ही दुर्लभ पंक्तियां हैं. उसी गोष्ठी में एक बार गुरुदेव ने मुझे अपनी प्रसिद्ध कविता सन्यासी उपगुप्त मथुरा नगरी प्राचीरेर तले एहदा छिलेन सुप्त की आवृत्ति कराई थी. मैं उनकी एक कुमाऊनी अबंगाली छात्र होने पर भी त्रुटिहीन उच्चारण में बांग्ला कविता की आवृत्ति कर सकती हूँ, ऐसा कुछ परिचय भी उन्होंने दिया था. पुरस्कार स्वरूप देखते देखते मेरी हस्ताक्षर पुस्तिका एक से एक दुर्लभ कविताओं से भरकर पूरे आश्रम के छात्र छात्राओं में ईर्ष्या का विषय बन गई थी. एक उद्धरण का लोभ मैं संवरण नहीं कर पा रही हूँ. हिमालयर कन्या तुमी गौरीर मतन नरबे फुटियो हाসি फुलिक जेमन सकलेर भालो बेशे करो आपनार शांतिर निर्झर झरे जीवने तोमार. So she also refers to a pencil sketch Gurudev had made as a prize for speaking and singing in Bangla, and he considered her somebody who had flowed there. And she also confesses that Gurudev told her that she wrote her first short story in Bangla, but Gurudev told her her first language was Hindi and she must write in Hindi. So the book is full of, anecdotes, which, there are portions about his Gurudev's warmth, about the songs that he wrote. And I think the big thing that she writes about is that she entered the ashram. She and her sister and brother entered the ashram 2 days before the Dolotsav, which was a big festival there, which celebrated Holi in a very different way. And it began with Dolotsav, she says, and she said her stay there ended with another Dolotsav. She was hardly over her fatigue of Dolotsav when she was made to go back to her home. And she remembers with great nostalgia the song that they used to sing, which said, Ore Grohavashi Tora Khol Dwar Khol. Here was a community which opened, which forced even the Grahvasi, the Grahastis, the stern Brahminical families to open their doors and come and meet everybody. And 2 days later, she was transported to a very different world, where, she was to become a Gidni, a Grahvasini, with all the niyam qaida of North Indian Brahminical bride. So when I see her writings, I find the same mix of humor and nostalgia, and also a foreboding that there is much more to life than I have been let on. But a great sense of gratitude to Santiniketan for having given her a kind of upbringing which made her not only put up with all that, but also to continue expressing herself fearlessly. So I think that's the most beautiful part of this book. And I'm glad Ira has done a superb job of bringing out that voice of my mother's.
Yeah, both are, thank you so much. Both are very feisty, spirited women. And I think Santiniketan, the experience that they had here in terms of working with a very interestingly cosmopolitan community. So I think Santiniketan was the best mix of the provincial in the positive sense of the term and the cosmopolitan, and that kind of comes through in the work that they do later. So now let's have a probably a more generic, broad-based discussion. One would be around language, because you see. The point that comes through in both the memoirs is that Santiniketan did manage to bring people together. It was the welcomingness is in both in terms of acclimatizing or acculturating people into Bangla, without which both Mahasweta Devi and Shivani wouldn't have really got under the skin of Robindra Songit. I mean, they're so avid and so passionate about songs. Songs are a major component of the books. I mean, there are so many songs come through all the time. And that kind of tells you that, well, it's, and I remember a point where Ira, I don't know if that came through in the reading, no, but Shivani says at some point she had to stand up to a lot of criticism about what was alleged to be her quote unquote Bengali romanticism. But I think Santiniketan, under Tagore and his able brood of very, very creative teachers, Hazari Prasad Dwivedi included, was able to kind of strike that wonderful balance between, grooming people into the particularities of Bangla and the culture around it, and still be open to all sorts of other cultural spaces and forms, including, that could be from food to anything. That's the extraordinary place about it. And that one phrase that stuck in my mind is, our freedom actually disciplined us somewhere. What a wonderful paradox. What a very creative paradox. So what would your thoughts be on language? And the other question was about women in Santiniketan, or women who from Santiniketan. Your thoughts on that, please.
Radha or
Yes.
would?
Whoever would like to begin, maybe Radha, or and then, well, in whichever order you're comfortable with.
I think these are very interesting questions. Question of language. I thought about it a lot when I was translating the book. First of all, translation itself makes you think of, across languages, and trying to translate Mahasweta's memoirs from Bangla into English itself made me dwell upon this. And then Mahasweta herself has talked about how the dream of Vishwabharat, the dream university she has in her mind, is a place where lots of translations happen that kind of bring Indian literature to the world and bring world literature into India. So language is in some ways at the core of the idea of the memoir as well, because it's about recapturing memories in language in order to be able to communicate them. And what you're saying about acculturation and how Santiniketan had this ability to absorb people into the, into the linguistic culture of Bengali, as it were, and yet remained open to all kinds of other linguistic influences and presences and interactions. I mean, the interactive mode and the heterogeneity that was embraced there, I think, is really a model that we need to think about again in our present times. And the passage I read out began with a reference to the construction of China Bhavan. So what I'm saying is that we perhaps need to revisit the early Santiniketan model again in our present times, because I was just saying that the passage I read out began with the construction of China Bhavan. And way back then, Rabindranath had this vision of getting to know other lands, other cultures, other languages, and bringing that mutual understanding into a place like Santiniketan, not even a city like Kolkata, but in the lap of nature, in the heart of a forest, to bring languages from elsewhere, cultures from elsewhere into the everyday ethos of the place. And then Hindi Bhavan, I mean, he had the foresight to think that Hindi would be one day a very important language. I mean, today we are saying, why don't we know China better? Our immediate neighbor, but he had that vision. So I think if we broaden this whole question about languages, not just to think about Bengali and non-Bengali, but to look at world languages and how all of that came together in this environment where heterogeneity was respected and celebrated, and it was a way of life, it was a way of thinking. I think, definitely it's something worth holding up the mirror to even now.
Thank you. So Ira and Mrinal on language and also on the question of women coming from...
I'll do the language, let Mrinal do the women. She's better at that. For me, the biggest challenge was how to preserve her voice and efface my own. Because in this book, her voice is what matters. She was the one who went to Santiniketan. And these are her memories, not mine. I may have heard them as stories later, but the source of all the memories of Santiniketan, which is what this book really is all about, were hers. So for me, I had to constantly, the translation took me, the first draft took me no time at all, because as I said, it's a slim little book. But I worked and worked on wherever I felt that my voice was intruding, or that something that I had, introduced, which was not in the original. That's a temptation that many translators, fall into committing. I know, you keep forgetting that the author is someone else. It can't be your work. It's like bringing up somebody else's child as a foster mother, as a dhaima, and then you realize कि भाई वो बच्चा तो किसी और का था ना, it's not your child. So that was for me the lodestar with which I did this book. The second is that my mother's language is always very rich and literary. Even her Hindi is so Sanskritized and so full of Gujarati, Bengali, all the things that she knew, those languages constantly intrude into her writing. I wanted it to be reflective of that kind of layering, but also to preserve the direct and simple way that children look at things and remember them. So it was a double whammy on both sides. But she has this unerring, and I think it's because she was a very musically sophisticated person. She had been tutored by the best teachers, and throughout the book she mentions how she constantly they learn Brahmo Sangeet from Chaudhrani Devi, Devi Chaudhrani, Tagore's niece, was it? And
Yes,
from,
Radha
yes,
Chakravarti.
and Kshiti Mohan Babu, the Kabir that she learned from him, the Pakhavaj and the Drupad that she learned from elsewhere. I mean, she was constantly picking up these snippets from all over. Music was really her great interest. And there's one portion where I forget who it is, where I think Kshiti Mohan Babu says that one day you'll make a great name for yourself as a singer. And she says that was one prophecy that I could never fulfill because my life took me very far away. I mean, there is regret for that, but she doesn't dwell on it. It was what Mrinal was saying, that she got married into this very conservative family, and my grandfather apparently told her that हमारे घर की बहुएं गाना गा के पैसा नहीं कमाती हैं. So she was not allowed to sing on air or whatever, when she had been a performer when she was in Santiniketan. So all that, those bad memories she just eliminates, because I think that this was a book that she wrote with a very different focus, So I'm glad that it's worked out this way. And even though I've read it 150 times, when the book came to me, it got such a beautiful cover too. And yes, and this flower is actually taken from, that is the Hindi book. And this is the English version. That flower, that beautiful gulmohar flower, I think it is actually a painting which was in one of her autograph book pages that Mrinal had. So, the designer played around with that, and it is like a fallen flower in the dust. It really is something. The color of the gulmohar remains as vivid, no matter that it fell elsewhere, it left the tree. I mean, there is all that. Yes, there is a lot of unspoken pain at what her life became later. But equally, I think there is a lot of joy from the memories that she gets. And I always feel that, your childhood memories are really what sustain you. It's as you grow older, you remember so much of your childhood. It comes back to you, things that you had buried away, smells, sounds, voices. It's constantly there. It's like unraveling an old pullover. The last to go are the base, the stitches that you put in first. So that's how your memory dissolves. You go from one end to the other, and those are the ones that you stick to, because I whenever we talk to each other every day, Mrinal and I, or my brother and I, or my other sister and I, we are constantly talking about, do you remember, do you know, who was that person and where did that person live? So it is all to do with conjuring a universe of memories. And this is really what Santiniketan is. One last thing I want to say, is that, I've spelled Santiniketan with an SH. And many people, all my Bengali friends, took serious umbrage to that. And they said, no, you can't have an SH, it's SANT. And I told them, I said, I'm going to write SH because you guys in Bengal have colonized and, sort of created a fence around Santiniketan that don't forget, it belonged to everyone. Tagore never wanted that it should only be a part of the Bengali cultural memory. It is. My mother was not a Bengali. She was a Kumauni girl who went all the way from Almora. There were others, and that's why that bit about Khairuddin from Sumatra and, you know, somebody else from somewhere else. These were people who came from different parts of the world. But, you know, for them, Santiniketan, and they all, I mean, it's not a surprise that all of the books that people have written as memories of Santiniketan are based in some way on the anthem of Santiniketan. That was their base song. But that is why I deliberately wrote Santiniketan with an SH, even though I know that it's spelled with an S.
But it's phonetic. It's more phonetic.
Yes, it is, yes. And you know, that is how the rest of us look at Santiniketan. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. To Mrinal, would you like to say a few words?
Just one thing that struck me is that the biggest takeaway from Santiniketan for my mother was that it told her it's all right. Whatever you do is all right. If you do not fit within the parameters of a bhalo manush, it's all right. She refers to it. She says, गुरुदेव ने आश्रम के लिए कई कविताएं खास विशेष रूप से लिखी थी और ये छात्र वर्ग में विशेष लोकप्रिय थी. पिकनिक पर हम इन्हें आनंद से गाते थे. भालो मानुष नाई रे मोरा भालो मानुष नाई. I'm not a good person. I'm not a good person. I've heard it from my own children and my grandchildren also. গুণের মধ্যে এই আমাদের গুণের মধ্যে এই দেশে দেশে নিন্দা রটে পদে পদে বিপদ ঘটে. No, everything happens to us. I'm not a good person. I do not vouch for my own goodness. And another song she says, which was very popular, was Na gan gabar dal re amar na gala sadha. We are singers, but we sing very badly. Our throats are bad. Our enunciation is bad. Moder bhairav rage ravir rage mukhe andhar. Amader ei amel kante samavayer chote. Padar kukur sasware fugare ote. Amar kebal mori bhaye dhurjatitar. So you learn to laugh at idiosyncrasies of your own and of the world around you. And I think that makes you a much better, much more tolerant and much more inclusive human being. I think that is the best takeaway that I find in this book.
Thank you. On that note, Bhalo Manush Noire Mora. So it's a lovely way to end. I hope we'll keep that spirit alive. So thanks so much. It's been such a lovely, such an enriching discussion. So my thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Ananya.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I love listening to all of that. And I'm looking forward to reading both the books now, as soon as they're out. Thank you, Ananya. Thank you so much. Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
The previous session was a pre-recorded session. We've had to resort to pre-recording some of the sessions on this two-day schedule due to connectivity, anxieties, and issues, especially for people who were linking in from outside the metropolises. So, Ananya, would you like to see if there's anything in the chat?
There are several old-timers, as it were, both among attendees and panelists. Perhaps they'd have questions to put. Professor Shiv Kumar,
Yes.
and there's Kathleen O'Connell listening in from Canada. So, so I'm sure they.
I think we have people from quite far-flung areas. Okay, question from Meenakshi Malhotra. All the panelists, are both the memoirs available? You can both answer. Your respective publishers will be happy, no doubt.
The Shivani book is available, has been available for a while as a pre-order, but now I think from 27th May onwards, it's available on their on the Amazon website if you wish to order. Since retail trade is, poor thing, behind locked doors just now, I don't think you can go into a bookshop in large parts of India. But you can order in. It's available both as a hardcover and as a Kindle version. So if you go to the Penguin website, or if you go to the Amazon website, you should be able to get it.
Yeah, I read a Kindle version, so
Yes.
it was very easily done. So it's very
Particularly
much
if you're
on
abroad.
Amazon.
Yes. If you're abroad, and two of my boys don't live in India, and for territorial reasons, I think the books can't be shipped abroad yet from here, but they've all downloaded the Kindle version, and that works for them.
There is another,
My book is,
but then,
sorry,
go ahead,
I just
please.
wanted to say that my book is not yet out. The publication got delayed. The process was slowed down due to the pandemic, but it should be out before the end of the year. And it is published in India. It is published by Seagull, and internationally it will be distributed by the University of Chicago Press. And it is already announced on Amazon. I don't know if pre-orders are possible yet, but it should be out shortly.
There's one from Shudev, who asks, I was just wondering if there are any mention regarding development issues in Santiniketan then. So would Radha and Ira respond to that?
So I did read out a short passage where she's talking about how Santiniketan has changed, but she does not, and she does talk about how, in a general way, about how it's possible to raise an edifice of, 300 stories, but how restoring nature's balance is difficult, once you have destroyed it. So these issues come up, but she does not specifically talk so much about development issues in Santiniketan at present. In Mahasweta Devi does not directly go there, but it's there in the way she articulates things in the book about how things were then, implying that they are not quite the same now. And that's kind of part of the running critique of the present, which we hear in the book, even when it's not directly articulated.
Right. Ira?
I can remember just one bit where towards the end, when Tagore was very ill and almost, at the end of his life, he told these children that they had set up a special powerhouse which would give them, so that they could read. Now you won't have problems with electricity, is what he says. But other than that, I don't distinctly remember anything specific relating to because the world that my mother describes in her book, at least, is a very rural pastoral world where the Guru Palli, where the teachers lived, were just, mud and thatch cottages. Their swimming pool was a pokhur, or the Kopai River, as Mahasweta ji also mentions. So I don't think that was so much. I mean, they just accepted that this is what living in an ashram is about. And I don't think they aspired to any, I don't remember them complaining. At least my mother in her memoirs doesn't complain that we had this problem, or we had, mosquitoes biting us or whatever. Nothing like that ever disturbs the tenor of the book. Maybe those issues came up later.
Perhaps, yes. So Kathleen would like us to address something that we probably didn't have the time to discuss at length, women of Santiniketan. So over to our panelists for that. So Ira, would you like to start, or Radha? Whoever is.
I think my mother's book, because it talks of her childhood and early girlhood, was not really divided into a gendered world. I don't think that there's any overt or conscious distinction between girls and boys. Yes, there was a girls' hostel, and she mentions their French warden who was very strict, and a lot of girlish pranks and tricks that they played, as young girls do. But I don't see any mention of a crush on somebody, or anything that I'm sorry, Kathleen, I cannot recall anything from the book. Maybe I've missed it. But even from what I remember, there is, it's a generic class of students. It's children, really. And there seems to be there's a huge amount of awe about, for instance, Satyajit Ray, who she always, he always had a very towering presence in their lives. He was a little older than my mother, so he was actually my uncle's friend and his contemporary, my mother's older brother, who was also a student. And but it's mostly about the life of these children in classes where there is some mischievous boy who's who throws a snake one day at one of their teachers. And no, I'm sorry, I just can't remember any. Maybe if you go through the book, no, there wasn't. And I wish my sister was here, because she has a very sharp eye for checking out all these details. She would have been able to perhaps answer this more. But I cannot think of anything that made me think of that world as a woman's world.
There is that letter she writes anonymously to somebody who had advertised in the personal columns, asking for a convent-educated, fair, bride or something. And she took it upon herself to thank this person, just to. Because she didn't
How
like the
dare
idea.
he send a matrimonial for somebody who should be beautiful, accomplished, fair, etc., etc. So then they take it on at this whole bunch of naughty girls to take up this challenge and get into a terrible scrape from which Gurdial Malik rescues them.
Yes.
Chachaji, as they called him. Yeah, that's an interesting thing.
And one of the teachers turns a blind eye. I mean, she's saved. So it is a lot about this place.
So if I can comment on that, that shows that there was already a very strong sense of outrage that these should not be value systems by which women were or young girls were going to be judged. So that does say a lot about the way their education had already prepared them to think of a relationship between women and men. Yeah, interesting.
I was wondering, since Ondura Devshen and Nandana Devshen are here, and lovely to have them, would they have notes to exchange about things they may have heard from their mother and the kind of memoirs that we've been talking about?
Radha, did you want to say anything about this question in Mahasweta's work?
Well, very quickly, I want to say that Mahasweta was in Santiniketan. Her first stint there was as a very young girl. She went there at the age of 10, and she left when she was 13. And what we see is the freedom that she got, the total freedom, the rough and tumble of childhood activities. And she says at one point, commenting on Tagore's educational methods, that one of his innovative moves was to introduce co-education. And the atmosphere, where everybody was jumping into the river, everybody was climbing trees and doing things together. I think that itself is a commentary on the idea of women's freedom. And the other thing that comes to mind is the list of luminaries, female luminaries, who were kind of, there around Tagore, members of his family and his close circle, but also the women who were part of hostel life, the classmates, some of them who later became very eminent personalities, episodes centering around them. So the presence of women is very strongly felt in the text. But what we really see is the way in which the atmosphere in Santiniketan drew them out instead of keeping them cloistered, and the intellectual freedom they enjoyed, the intellectual curiosity that was fostered there. I think that comes through very vibrantly. So I felt that very strongly when I read, and that itself is a commentary when we look at the lives of women outside Santiniketan in Bengal at around the same time.
Right. And I remember now reading, when I was reading the extract in the book, women who were part, there was the who was sort of very much part of his daily routine and who were looking after the household or the kitchen. Not it didn't come through as that was a domesticated role, but more like they were equally managing the daily system as much as, in a way that sort of gave them a dignity and a presence of their own. Yeah.
I suddenly remembered one little incident from what you were saying, is how when his granddaughter was to get married, and Ratindra Babu, his son, came from Calcutta to ask his father to give him some money, and to, they wanted a grand splash as was expected of a feudal family like the Tagores. And Tagore was terribly upset. And Maitri Devi has written about it, and my mother quotes from Maitri Devi's memoir, where she says that Ratindra Babu was very, how shall I say, was overawed by the presence of his father, and would take off his shoes when he entered his father's room. And he was a bit of an eccentric. He used to come with a dholi of pan because he couldn't get pan where he was, whatever. And Tagore was so angry with this request that he said that, why can't he understand that this goes against everything that I have ever taught and believed in? And that when he went to meet Gandhiji in Wardha, that's Ratindra Babu, he came back so impressed that it was such a Spartan place, and that they were made to sit on packing cases because there were no chairs for them to sit on. And so he says that how can he admire that and at the same time want that his daughter should have the kind of big princely wedding that he has in his mind. Ironically, though, and so all these people got very worried that, he wouldn't attend the wedding. And this was his favorite granddaughter. Anyway, he did attend the wedding, and the wedding was a great event, and it was held in, I think, in Doordarshan, if I'm not mistaken. But that episode comes across where he didn't want the the traditional wedding for his granddaughter that feudal families were expected to set up.
I was going to say that what Mrinal says really sums it up for women of Santiniketan, about owning up to the way they are and not being, particularly amenable to being fitted into boxes, as it were. So they own up to not conforming. That's something that probably still remains among luminaries, of course, but even among ordinary women we see around us. Since Nandana and Antara Devshen are with us, so did you have something to add to that, to the conversation?
Well, it's wonderful. We feel so privileged to have been able to listen to all of you speak about this. There is so much to say, and I am conscious of time. But this just because you were asking about memories earlier. I just wanted to say that my mother actually had very vivid memories of meeting Rabindranath Tagore when she was a toddler, and it's a very funny story which I won't go into, but she found herself sitting in his very famous chair, and she was also quite hungry, and the story, her memory, very beautifully had beautiful details about how he very lovingly prepared a kind of magical dish from Komla Lebu for her, and it's something that that was a very, very vivid and precious memory for her. And the other part of it, on the other end, when she was still very young when he died, and she had equally vivid memories of the chaos and how distraught the city was, and how distraught our grandmother was when he died, and how everybody came out on the streets and were and Dimma was also heartbroken about the loss, but also heartbroken by the fact that there was there was mayhem on the streets, and everybody was trying to hold on to his body and get a bit of the covering of the shroud he was covered with, and that it was a very disturbing experience for my Dimma, and it was an equally disturbing experience for my mother, who was extremely young at that time. So I think she had a very, she was very strongly influenced by Tagore in her writing, and she wrote about that. As indeed every Bengali writer is, I would think, but she wrote about it a lot, and she also wrote about to the point that you were making earlier. I think she felt very strongly about how Tagore was how his feminism informed a whole generation of writers, and that there was really no one else who did that in the way that he did. So anyway, Didi?
Thank you, Ananya, for asking us to put in whatever we might. It was really lovely to hear Ira and Mrinal and Radha, all old friends, talking about a place that we love and a time that we look back with great fondness at. Santiniketan for my sister and me will always remain home. Since my sister has already talked about my mother's, yes, that's a very famous story of my mother actually being invited by Tagore, and when she got there and she was given all kinds of food but no pulao, she protested because she said, how can there be a nemontonno without pulao? At which point Tagore got a baby pulao made for her. My mom was about 2 years old, for her with nuts and orange, those little thingies, orange put in to make it look more festive. That is one story. But Santiniketan to us was a place that we visited every single holiday. And so all the wonderful things of Santiniketan that we later on read about, and it was very lovely hearing Mrinal and Ira talk about the intellectual, the standpoint, the way they conducted their lives, everything. But to us, it was so normal. We assumed that everybody would sing. We assumed that people would, girls would ride bicycles, that they would have flowers in their hair. All kinds of things that were very, actually, if you stepped out of the Santiniketan culture, you didn't really find. But the feminism that you saw in Santiniketan was also very special. It wasn't the kind of feminism that you saw outside. It was assuming that women were important and assuming that women could look beautiful, be very graceful, do all the artsy things, and take a lot of care in grooming themselves. At the same time, be taken seriously. That is something that we saw in Santiniketan much before it became a common way of doing feminism elsewhere. Because when we were growing up, feminists were trying to be very ugly. And except for some people like Gloria Steinem, it was like you're either a feminist, in which case you're not really looking after your grooming or your looks, or you're just trying to be physically unattractive, because it was like either you have personality or you have beauty. So that was a binary that Santiniketan never had, and we don't have anymore. So I think I hold that very dear, that kind of attitude that came out of Tagore's holistic approach to life and intellectual understanding, and living in a free world where everybody was valued. So that's I think what I would say about women in Santiniketan.
Just a big thank you to Ananya for being a wonderful moderator. Thank you to Ira and Mrinal for being part of this panel. Thank you so much to Radha for so readily agreeing to do this with us today with your book. And Nandana and Antara, an additional treat to have you back on screen for a few additional
A
minutes.
treat for us too.
So much. And I think the fact that these two sessions came one after the other has become a wonderful package, because you've actually seen three, sort of major women writers and connected with Santiniketan and the experience. So that was really lovely. Thank you so much. Good night.